Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the CBI at 10. I'm James Harding, and it's a pleasure to be back with you all again this morning. One of the, I suppose, curiosities of this long pandemic year has been that even when there's been more intense fear at the times of premium lockdown, there's actually, if anything, more uncertainty and anxiety as we open up again, as we begin to try and figure out what life is going to be like in the future. And partly because it's Mental Health Week, but partly also because I think that as the rules change, we're trying to reconsider how we live our lives. This morning's webinar is really focused on that subject, keeping mental health front of mind, that all the commitments that we made to ourselves and all the worthwhile and serious-minded conversations we had about this in the course of the past year don't get lost as people rush back to work. And I'm delighted that we're joined by Poppy Jaman, who is the Chief Exec of the City Mental Health Alliance, Anna Koch, who is the Senior Policy Director at the CBI on this subject, David English, who's the Mental Health Lead at Panasonic. Just before we all got on this, I should tell you, we were discussing how best to open a meeting, that we should actually all check in with each other, see how we're feeling. And David said the one thing you shouldn't do is cut straight to the business, that is really not what you should do. So David, apologies. I'm going to cut straight to the business and go to Matthew Fell, who's the Chief Policy Director at the CBI. And Matthew, say, before we get into the mental health chat, exactly, look, David's already, appalled by how badly it's going. But Matthew, obviously, this is quite a meaty week in terms of reopening and quite a meaty one in terms of the agenda of the CBI. Will you just talk us through that before we get into the conversation at hand this morning?
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thanks, James, and good morning, everyone. James, as you say, I think a busy couple of weeks for the CBI and for the country, in actual fact. So just to start with this week, we've got quite an international focus going on, actually. We're bringing together the sister federations of the CBI from all of the G7 countries around the world in a B7 meeting. Our thought here is really to try and inform the G7, which meets in Cornwall later this year in June, with some of the business priorities for getting the whole world focused on recovery and economic growth. So we're trying to sort of say, look, can we get back to a situation where we've got a whole lot of cooperation and collaboration going on, and can business lead from the front on that, and hopefully political leaders will follow suit on that. So we've got sessions focused around trade, on digital, and also on net zero as we begin that countdown towards COP26 later this year and get some momentum going into that. So that's the international piece. We're also a couple of weeks out, James, from a big bit of CBI work we're calling Seize the Moment, which is our blueprint, if you like, for a decade of better growth. So highly ambitious, but rooted in reality. Where can the UK compete and win around the world in future? So we'll be saying an awful lot more on that in the next couple of weeks. So please do look out for that. I think, though, then, James, more Matthew, immediately. Yeah, sure.
Matthew, just a second. So just give us the timetable on that.
So that is 2 weeks out. So the B7 takes place this week ahead of the government's G7 in June. And then the CBI's piece of work, Seize the Moment, our economic plan, that'll be out 2 weeks today. So do keep an eye out for that.
Okay, and that's the invitation to contribute. It'll start then.
We'll be launching that, firing the starting pistol. People can absolutely get involved from there on in. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So I guess, James, then a bit more immediately on the COVID front, a couple of things to mention there. I think we'll get official confirmation later on today from the Prime Minister that the COVID roadmap is going ahead as planned. So from next Monday, the 17th of May, I think we're set to see reopening of indoor hospitality, accommodation such as hotels, and some of that indoor entertainment, museums, cinemas, children's play, and so on. So that looks like it's going to be very good news. Against that backdrop, we're pushing for a bit more clarity between now and the June date in the roadmap around social distancing, so critical to inform businesses what's going to happen with the 2 metre, the 1 metre plus, hopefully 0 metre rule very soon, what the setup is going to be around the use of COVID status certificates, and also what the future of workplace testing is going to be from June onwards. So we're pushing for that clarity. And then on Friday, just last week, we heard an update on international travel, which was sort of a bit of a mixed bag, really. I mean, firstly, good that the stay in the UK's restriction is going to be lifted overall, and we're going to see this introduction of a traffic light system, so green, amber, red, with a dozen countries on the green list from the off, Portugal, Australia, Singapore, amongst those. But I think a little bit of a disappointment and frustration perhaps that there wasn't more countries on that list from the starting point. Of course, you know, the risk-based approach has to be the right one, but it does mean that we're a long way, I think, from being able to get back to being fully reopened and trading our way to recovery for those businesses who are reliant on international travel. And of course, this isn't just about holiday destinations, but so many businesses finding it really important to be able to service their international markets as well. So as soon as the facts allow, the more we can get onto that, so much the better.
And Matthew, can I just ask you about that? If your main market is not, as it happens, the Falkland Islands or Tristan da Cunha, and you're thinking to yourself, how do we actually approach grant chat, transport, and try to, and I'm understanding that it is transport that is sort of holds the list in this. Is there a channel between the CBI and transport to start discussing new markets or countries, sorry, that should open, that might be moving from amber to green?
Yeah, well, James, I mean, I think, look, we're in really good contact with the Department of Transport and other parts of government all the way through this. So we've been helping to inform and shape this sort of risk-based approach with the traffic lights and so on. And that is all very good. Ultimately, obviously, government is in possession of the facts and the data around the health pieces, which determines, you know, are you required to quarantine or not, depending on the status of a given country. What do you need to do around testing? I think from the CBI's point of view, it's just really helpful if we can inform, as we have been doing, where are some of the key markets around the world where actually this travel for business is really, really important, just so that they have all of that data and information at their fingertips when they're weighing up the decisions. That's kind of our role, I think, and one we'll continue to do.
Okay, Matthew, thank you. And I should have said at the top, obviously the aim of these conversations, these CBI 10, is that we share those things. So if people have got points of view on that or any other elements of the, you know, the roadmap, you know, do message and we'll try and weave them into the conversation. Certainly CBI will respond, and of course, as relates to our main topic this morning. Matthew, do you want to tee that up?
Yeah, well, just final thoughts from me before we get into the conversation, James. I think, look, mental health and well-being is just shot to the top of the agenda during this pandemic. It's not surprising. I think pretty much all of us have been dealing with some combination of either isolation, the blurring of boundaries between home and work, juggling responsibilities, whether it be childcare or older relatives and friends and family, etc. So there's a whole lot of issues going on. And not surprisingly, I think recent data from Public Health England suggested that just about half the country say that the pandemic has impacted negatively on their mental health and well-being at some point over the last 12 or so months. I think my sense, James, is that actually even before we got into the pandemic, this is a topic that was rising pretty rapidly up companies' agenda and putting more and more focus on it. But we've just seen that massively accelerated in the last year. I think many employers have found themselves on the front line in the early months of the pandemic from a sort of physical health perspective, and then very, very rapidly hot on the heels of that, particularly as we got into autumn and this second and third lockdowns, mental health was very much top of the agenda. So that's the idea today, actually, is to help companies navigate, you know, what should they be doing right now, but equally, as you said at the top, what should they be doing to bake in some of this learning so that we get it right for the long term, as well as we all begin to get back to the future of work, whatever that might look like. So we'll hear today, particularly from Anna, who's updated a CBI guide around keeping mental health front of mind. We'll put details of that in the chat and Anna will expand on that. But I think what we'll find as we get into the conversation is just a few key learnings, really. Leadership from the top being so important to set the right tone. I think targeting actions sooner so that you can get towards early interventions wherever possible is always the best approach. And then finally, just setting the right culture that makes it a priority right across the business, okay to talk about, because we're all learning in this space all the time and we'll continue to do so. So James, that's just a few thoughts from me. We'll get stuck into the conversation and see how we go.
Thank you, Matthew. And I'm going to come to you in a minute just to talk about this, the position of the CBI. I'm struck by the title of it, keeping mental health front of mind, as if, you know, the sort of the return to work and the stresses on business and the opportunities now as the economy reopens, you know, perhaps pushes that agenda aside. But Poppy, I wonder whether I can start with you. We often talk about these things in the way in which Matthew framed it. You know, what's needed from businesses, what's needed from the leaders of those businesses. I just wonder whether through the City Mental Health Alliance, you've got a sense of what people working in different kinds of businesses, small and big, are saying to you about what they need now from the companies they work at.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, James, and thank you for inviting me as well today. Great way to start Mental Health Being Week. So yeah, the priority of every leader and every board I'm speaking to is this emergence out of lockdown, and what does the blended workplace look like? Who's excluded, who's included? Do we run the risk of people feeling even more isolated? How do you create this new culture? And all of those things have a significant impact on people's well-being because it's uncertainty. And we know that one of the things that change does, whether even if it's positive change, like for example, getting married, the stressful period leading up to that is actually quite, difficult. And then and this hasn't been all positive. People have experienced bereavement, loss, the trauma, if you've experienced COVID itself, and then the job losses. I mean, there was 3 data points that I wanted to share, and they're relevant to your question. One of them, and these are ONS data, but more than 80,000 more children under 18s have been referred to NHS services, which is 28% more from 2019. And Matthew, you alluded to that earlier, which is 1 in 10 people up till March 2020 had moderate or severe depression, which is adults. But in June, we knew that 1 in 5 people experienced moderate to severe depression. And then the Centre for Mental Health, the third data point, is said that 10 million more people will be experiencing mental ill health in our country. So if you look at those,
How many was that? Sorry, I didn't hear.
10 million relating to the pandemic. And as Matthew said, the picture was pretty bad beforehand. It's significantly got worse. And I guess if you look at those data points, that's our children. And if my child is not well, I'm not going to come to work and perform at my optimum. And so therefore, you might want to go, any leader or any board that's ignoring these data points and reverting back to, well, actually, the pandemic is over or lifted and we need to get back to normal, or there is no going back. There is only forward, and these issues have to be considered in the rebuild phase of the pandemic, and the culture needs to change. And I know David and Anna are going to speak more specifically about the things that are changing, but I'm every City Mental Health Alliance member, and I guess we are the business for mentally healthy, we are the community for mentally healthy businesses around the world, and our members are thinking about this in a lot of detail. So we I guess are ahead of the game. But if it's not on your boardroom agenda, or if it's slipped off your boardroom agenda, I would just urge everyone to stick it back on the boardroom agenda. Make sure that there is, I mean, I've seen some of our members have actually put it on their risk register, which is, 3 years ago, I would have never expected that to happen. And not just put it on their risk register, really thought about the mitigating actions and the resources that are required. So not just put in a mental health and wellbeing lead in a role, then thinking about every line manager needs to be trained up and educated on how to have a check-in and check-out conversation, not just at the beginning of meetings, but during meetings. Developing a well-being platforms like Latham Watkins have done, for example, where they've created something called Care Connect that integrates counselling, coaching, and other resources. And they're just one example. PwC, KPMG have given complete flexibility to staff to do their jobs when they like. There's positives and negatives around that because people then don't stop. But actually, experimentation is really crucial. And I would say the most important thing from my perspective is leadership vulnerability. If business leaders and board members who are seen at senior position not talking about their mental health, the cumulative multiple stresses that Matthew referred to that has had an impact on them and how they've navigated that. You're not going to get people talking about it, and particularly those people that are younger, who may be feeling the pressure of the uncertainty and job security, they're not going to talk about it. And we need to make sure that we are fostering a culture where people are talking about it, because let's not forget 1.7 million people are employed at the moment, and there was just under 400,000 redundancies in our country. So that whole financial health of our people is huge, and health inequalities is increasing. But I'll stop there.
Poppy, look, my God, there's so much there. Look, I'd love us to actually get a chance to go into some of those points you made about counselling and coaching, about flexibility, about leadership vulnerability. But I wonder, Anna, whether you would just give us a view of what the argument is that the CBI is making of what it expects businesses, because I think a lot of people will massively sympathise with A, the scale of the problem, and B, the sense that business wants to and needs to do something about it. But there's a big gap between that and then actually having the resources and skills to deal with some of these issues. So how do you suggest businesses, and particularly SMEs, tackle something like this?
Yeah. So I think I can just talk about a couple of things that we've seen throughout the crisis that companies have done, that we have seen in our case studies in the guide as well. So I think one thing we've seen is, being able to early intervention and rapid response, which is especially, offering specific extra training that was already mentioned by Poppy to your line managers of how they can spot, mental health, poor mental health remotely. That was something that companies are very quickly to actually do when the crisis started. I think another thing that happened quite quickly is that people went out, senior management went out to people to actually speak to network groups, to their employees, how different groups were affected by the pandemic, and just to really understand the different things that they're experiencing. And then another thing that happened quite quickly is really having pulse surveys that happened quite regularly to understand how people are feeling and to actually respond quickly. So a lot of people have, felt isolated, or, and so companies actually spoke to their employees and had, things set up straight away. For example, resilience workshops or, quizzes to just make people feel like they belong to the company and that they're actually heard. I think another thing that actually happened quite quickly and that we have heard from a lot of businesses is that what Poppy already mentioned about, communication, and how employers, senior managers were actually encouraged to call up their employees for well-being calls and just kind of check in how they're doing. And also how line managers were encouraged to actually talk to their employees on a regular basis, to kind of like one-on-one chats, to actually have this conversation about how are you really doing, to really help people to go through these really difficult times. And I think the other point is around culture, how people have, because businesses have done these pulse check surveys, how they understood that, they need to act. And for example, implemented lunch breaks where there are no Zoom calls, or Fridays where there are no Zoom calls, because they just heard that, people are really fatigued by the constant calls they're having. It's just a couple of things we've heard from businesses as to what they've done during the pandemic. And I can, speak about a little bit what we think should be something that, we need to keep taking forward, because what we've really learned is this normalization about having a conversation of mental health is really helping people. And I think that's something really important that we need to keep going forward, as we, people might be anxious about returning to work. So the communication channel and normalizing this conversation of mental health is something that we need to keep. And also this ability to rapidly respond to challenges that people are experiencing through pulse check surveys and, constant communication is something that we need to keep doing. And it's big businesses can do that, and medium-sized business can do it, and we have actually heard also from small businesses that they're actually keeping these tools to actually communicate and normalize, and it's something that we need to keep doing going forward as well.
Okay, Anna, thank you. I'd love to talk about that, because I think hearing about those practical things, you know, lunches, Fridays, no Zooms, pulse surveys, those things are actually really helpful to people. I just want to bring David in. Firstly, David, I want to see if we can model some good behavior here. How are you? Checking in. How are you feeling?
Yeah, absolutely. I can confirm, even though it's Monday, 20 past 10, I can confirm I'm living the dream currently. Yeah.
I'm relieved. I'm enormously relieved. But David, tell us within. I want to come back with Anna in a moment to some of these focus on small businesses, but in a bigger company like Panasonic, just tell us a little bit about what the struggle is like as the economy reopens to keep this mental health agenda front of mind, because I can imagine that the priorities do shift.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, going, if you like, skipping forward to as we are now, hopefully, as Matthew said earlier, we're getting to the phase where we're now going to consider asking our people to come back to the office or back to their roles. We've already started doing some groundwork on that. So a couple of weeks ago, we sent a survey out to everybody. It's all anonymized. And basically, we asked some very basic questions, obvious ones. Do you want to come back to the office? If you'd like to come back to the office, how many days would you like to come back to the office? We realise, like most companies, the landscape of the office now is going to be different. The way people are going to work. So we anticipate there'll be a lot more hot desking. So we said to people, hey, how would you feel about using a hot desk? What are the challenges? What do you need in a hot desk environment to, you know, to make you comfortable? So that's one of the things we've done. We've already surveyed that, and results are coming back, and we'll use that as our return to work plan. We've also done, if you like, a day in the office walkthrough. So basically, it's a guide of from when they arrive at work, from car parking into the office, how they do, what they do during the day. And we're going to do, once again, we're going to do a video of the office, a walk around, just to give people peace of mind of the controls that we've got in place. But I think something that's very important is that we're going to invite people into the office, not to work. We're not interested in them coming into work. What we want them to do is we want them, and if they want family members, to come into our office space and just look around, walk around, to see how it is, how it's laid out, just to make them feel comfortable, and you know, just to make sure that they want to do it. But one thing that's very, very important, I have said, is when the communication goes out to say, you know, in line with government guidance, there is an opportunity, and if you feel comfortable to come back to the office, what we've said, and it's very important, is that the message we send out, the tonality and the language we use is very, very important. It's got to be a request. Yes, we're a business and we've got to run the business, and we've proved we still can. Yeah, during lockdown, we've still done business, but you know, we need to make sure people are confident, and it doesn't come across as a demand. It comes across, you know, as an opportunity. So the tonality is very, very important within that invitation to come back. So, you know, we've already started doing some work, and actually from corporate in Japan and senior people in Europe now, our advice to all of our people within the business is, we'd like you to see you do as standard at least 2 to 3 working days at home. Have a combination, because there have been some positives that have come out of lockdown. I discussed it earlier. I mean, we surveyed people a couple of months into lockdown 1, so around April, May time, and you know, people did say their work-life balance was absolutely fantastic. You know, there was people that they felt a lot more relaxed. There's people that had taken their children to school and collected. Family life had got better. Those that had a commute, some had commutes of up to 2 hours. They gained a lot more time. They felt a lot less stressed. Yeah. Of course, there were challenges as well, which gave us stuff to address. So social isolation and homeschooling were particular challenges.
Dave, can I just ask you one question though? I was struck, I don't know whether people saw, the FT reported this morning that the US banks, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, are really putting pressure on people to come back. Not putting pressure, they're saying come back to work, right? Come back to the office. Yeah. Meanwhile, European banks, HSBC, SocGen, are taking a much more flexible approach. Right now, I don't think at this stage we necessarily know a right or wrong. You may have a view on what right or wrong is. True. But the competitive dynamic of this, what happens, David, in a business where there might be some of the managers in Panasonic who go, David, I love your sort of invitation to return to work, but actually my team needs to get back in the office. We need, for cultural reasons and competitive reasons, to be back together. What do you say to people like that?
Well, this is why we're going to give inbuilt flexibility. I agree. there are certain people, and there are certain functions where people are going to come in, but if you're giving people an opportunity of balance, two in the office, 3 at home, or 3 in the office, 1 back, you can generally placate. And what we have said is, you know, maybe, and actually again it's about the people side of things, that maybe once a week, once a fortnight, we get everybody into the office to have a team meeting. And don't forget, we've changed, and so have our customer requirements has changed as well. So there is a flexibility, and it's so important, and I think it was alluded to earlier by Poppy and by Anna, is it's the message you get from senior managers that makes a difference. So when your senior man, when your MD and the senior managers say, no, this is what we want to do. Yeah, if a customer wants us definitely to, you know, to have a presence, a physical presence, then we'll do that. If the controls are in place, if that environment is COVID secure, and I've been involved in putting a checklist, a risk assessment together for any external visits if we're going to do them in the future, and that is obviously one of the things we're going to do. So I do agree, James, it's a challenge, but I do think if the message comes from senior, you know, from the senior people to say that let's keep this flexibility. If we need to come in for a particular reason, we'll do it. Our offices are COVID secure, meeting rooms are COVID secure. We use Teams very, very much, and you know, communication, things that we've done, and Poppy alluded it to, we communicated. Our senior managers, they were the ones that took it upon themselves to make these welfare calls.
David, thank you. I want to just put to Poppy and Anna, if I might, if you like, the counter view. There's a danger with a conversation like this, particularly in a week like this, and particularly with a group like this, where we're all sort of in riotous agreement about how important this is and how urgent it is, and the things that need to be done. But can I just channel, I think, some of the things that you'll hear on this subject? One is, and there are different versions of give me a break, basically. They are, one is, you know, we are in our businesses not skilled at dealing with mental health issues, right? So it's all very well to say we should engage with these, but don't expect us to be able to deal with, you know, you talk, Poppy, about moderate or serious depression. You know, there's no one in the business who's capable of dealing with these things. So don't ask us to handle things we can't. Or alternatively, frankly, we're a small business, we're 4, 6, 20 people, right? We just don't have the resources. And if you've noticed the high street, it's a pretty tough place out there right now. We've got a very big competitive challenge on our hands. We don't have the time to do some of the things that may be best practice in big businesses, but are just not available to us. And then I think there's also a kind of a point of view, which is we're all going soft here. There's a danger that we're going to pathologize issues, right, that are difficult and tough, but are not necessarily the kinds of serious mental health issues that people sometimes associate with that phrase. And so I wondered, Poppy, and I'm going to come to you, Anna, what you say to people who've got those reservations about this direction of travel.
Yeah, so there's 2 separate things there for me. So let's talk about businesses' sort of resistance to this, because either they don't get it or because there's actual financial or structural issues. So for big businesses, look, you know, Goldman's is a member of the City Mental Health Alliance, and they provide a lot of services to their people, whether it's online, whether it's on site. They do actually provide a lot of services, and as do most all of the City Mental Health Alliance members, because actually if you're not looking after your people, what your business isn't going to be successful in the first place. And pre-pandemic, the big discussion was, how do we ensure that we're attracting, retaining and growing talent? And you've got a thing that's emerging, which is employee activism, where employees, and particularly younger people, are turning to social media to go, we're not going to put up with this. So the reputational impact of not getting health and well-being right is big. So it's not just the right thing to do, it's also about the bottom line and attracting the right people to stay within your businesses. So it does have an impact on profit margins and I guess business resilience. And we've seen that in correlation to diversity indexes that sit alongside performance of the business financially. When an organization has fostered a strong sense of belonging, actually you see businesses are more successful, and I think that's what David's speaking to. So I think it's an oversight, and if you're not building mentally healthy cultures, you're not building an inclusive culture. And if you're not doing those two things, I don't know what leadership is about, because actually that's what the big organizations should be doing. I do feel for the smaller organizations where you've got 2 to 5 people, under 10 people in a company, what do you do about that? How do you actually support those people? And I think that's where it's even more important to foster the behavioral and the structural changes. So if you've got a 10-person organization, actually you might not be able to afford counseling for all of your employees should they need it, but you can have a check-in and check-out. You can actually develop resources that are there's loads around: Minds, Samaritans, Centre for Mental Health, Royal College of Psychiatry. I mean, the list is endless on what you can find on the internet to be able to pull together a resource pack for employees to go, these are the 5 things that you can do to look after your well-being so that you don't get to that place. And actually, if you do get to a place of crisis, here's 5 or 6 counsellors that we've identified that are willing to do reduced risk therapy for you. So there are, I think, giving information to people way before they get unwell, way before they need it, is really crucial and something every business can do. And the final bit that I'll come to, what you described as, you know, let's not pathologize this. There's look up the term languishing. So it's I think I've seen articles and some of the research that talk about languishing being the dominant emotion of 2021, where you're not flourishing, but you're not depressed. You're in that middle ground where you're not burnt out because actually you still have energy. You're not depressed because you don't feel hopeless, but you're not functioning to capacity. Your motivation is dulled. Your focus is disrupted. And I think a lot of us will experience this sort of weird flatness that we're feeling. And there are ways to come out of that, and that is about, you know, Mental Health Awareness Week's theme this year is environment and getting out there. Tiny little things like setting yourself small goals, getting out into green space, reconnecting with family members, whether it's postcards or telephone calls. It's all of those things that keep us well, like the 5 ways to well-being. And I do say to people, look that up.
Poppy, sorry, that's totally fascinating, and I haven't heard about this at all. But can I just ask you 2 questions about languishing? We could spend the rest of the day, and I'd actually quite like to do that. The question I've got is, one is, can you identify it? Can you identify these factors? And then the question I've got is really, what's the role of business or your employer in dealing with a problem like that? Because that's not necessarily an acute problem in the way in which some of us would have thought about a mental health problem that is the responsibility of employers. That feels like more of a chronic one. And I wonder how you think about what's the job of the boss there.
Well, I think so. If you ever think about it, James, so if we've got a load of people that are in that sort of middle place of, and I'd say there's sort of early warning signs for mental health struggles developing. That's another way to look at languishing. I'd rather, as the leader of my organization, go, wow, actually the motivation in my team is low. There's a real flatness. Let me do something so that people move into flourishing rather than depression and mental illness. So I think it's an opportunity to name what's going on for people, recognize that it's not burnout and then going to people, and for some people it might be burnout, for some people it might be depression, but unless you have the conversation and go, how is your motivation, what is your energy levels, how are you feeling, do you feel depressed, like let's get some, what does that look like, or is it actually we're in this middle space because we're emerging out of a horrific thing that's happened in the world and we now need to regain connection with ourselves, with our workplaces, with our family members. Let's actually open up ways of doing that. And that may mean redesigning the work. You know, long working hours culture cannot continue because we know it has an impact on mental health, and this is the time to actually change some of that.
So, Poppy, thank you. Anna, can I do something very unfair to you, which is that some of these CBI webinars feel like they're kind of philosophical discussions about the place of business, and then some of them sometimes feel like reading the small print of an engineering manual, and I'm afraid you're going to get that bit, because there's a really interesting question about ISO 45003, which I see David's nodding, is the global standard giving practical guidance on managing psychological health in the workplace. And what I don't, well, the question came in, which is from Matt Page, which is, do you think the development of ISO 45003, this guidance on psychological health at work, is a useful tool for organizations? Anna, this is to you.
Well, I think maybe I'm not quite sure. Maybe Poppy or David or Matthew want to actually come in on that first.
I have to confess, because I mean, my answer to Matt Page would be no, because I've never heard of it. But this is not my specialist area. I probably shouldn't admit that. There's a whole bunch of my colleagues who go, you see, we told you this is the problem. You need to read into it. But David, you were nodding, so can I come to you?
Yeah, I think it can be useful. I think going back to what Poppy says, really, it depends. There's not one thing that will fit everybody. I do believe that small. I took your going back to your earlier point. Small organisations. It isn't all about money, helping and supporting our people. If you've got 10 people in a business, in fact, early intervention can happen easier because you tend to know that person better. So you can have those conversations that Poppy is talking about. You can have those interventions, and it isn't all about money. As Poppy always did, she signposted, there is so much free information and support, helplines, links to all these organisations, but it depends. There is not one route, one roadmap, one support that will fit everybody. So yeah, absolutely. The standard that you talk about will help certain businesses. I don't know what you feel, Matthew. I mean, that's my approach. So what do you believe?
Yeah, well, just on that specifically, David, I mean, look, there's no perfect answer or got a textbook for all of this, but actually I think it is entirely useful to have reference points and guides, frameworks for us to follow, sort of thing. So that'd be my answer on it. James, just a few thoughts on what we've said so far, if that's okay, sort of thing. I mean, just going back a few moments, this point about how do we judge the critical issue around return to office and all of that sort of thing and get the pace right. I mean, look, I think connecting it to this agenda around mental health and well-being, the one thing I would say is, as advice to companies, make sure you don't pull back too soon from some of the measures and support that has been in place, because you just take one specific thing. I was chatting to our Working Families Network at the CBI recently, and while schools and so on are back up and running, many childcare facilities are not yet, for example. So high degree of anxiety if we just assume we're sort of back to how we were too rapidly without that sort of setup being in place. So that'd be my thought on the sort of pace of it. And also I think from employers, the conversation from a CBI point of view, look, we're trying to do this the same as every other organisation. And the one thing that I am highly confident about in our guidance that will stand the test of time is we won't get this right first time round. We will adapt as we go. So the conversation to learn what's working for people and what's not, I think those would be my thoughts around the return piece. James, on your point about, people are not necessarily skilled and trained in all of this, I think my answer to that would be, no, I'm not perfectly, as a manager and a leader, trained to the nth degree on all this stuff. But I think the job is to be able to have conversations and to know enough, and then also know the sort of limits of your knowledge, and be able to then sort of work out, how do I need to crowd in and who do I go and talk to and work that out, sort of thing. So I think that's more the job as a manager. And then the final thought would just be on this point about, actually, it's incredibly tough out there at the moment. We know many companies are still struggling to keep their head above water and so on. But I do think this comes back to the point about your job, and again, job for me as a manager and a leader is to try and create an environment where people are able to bring their best efforts to work and so on, and contribute and do their best. And I think that is the bit. If so many businesses are people focused these days, that is kind of the counter argument to say, look, we can't afford to do this. I think it is the way actually you ultimately get a more productive, healthier, happier workforce that turns into results and so on.
Matthew, thank you.
Sorry.
I just pick up Tom, David, one second. Just want to pick up one thing, because Tom Hadley's written a sort of a question, and also I think it contains a point really, which is to say, and this is a response to something you said, Anna, which was about the ways in which companies are responding and keeping track of how people are doing. As well as pulse surveys and one-to-one check-in calls, are we seeing many companies doing things that sit in the middle of these two responses, i.e. discussions with small groups of employees that also act as positive employee engagement on what the business can do better on supporting mental health? And I wondered, Anna, what your thought is on those kinds of things, as Tom Hadley says, that sort of sits between the pulse survey and the one-on-one.
Yeah, definitely. So we have seen quite a few companies actually doing exactly that. So talking to their resource networks and kind of like network groups in their companies to understand what's happening on the ground and to really understand how the pandemic impacts, different groups of people in different ways. And I think that's the critical thing here, to understand that, not everybody is impacted in the same way, but we might all feel very different about it. So I think that is a really good thing to do. You don't have to do the pulse survey every 2 weeks, and of course it creates a burden on businesses. So you can have focus groups and discuss it in smaller groups with your employees. Definitely, I think that's a great idea.
Thank you, Anna. David, in that same spirit, a final thought from you, which is, what's the thing that colleagues at Panasonic have said, actually, thank you, David, this is the best thing that we're doing, this is really helping?
I think it's open and honest conversations. I think they've appreciated that they've been kept up to date from a business point of view, but from a well-being point of view, we've made sure, as we said, the conversations, there's lots of different channels, lots of different ways they can have that conversation, one-to-one, one to manager, one to company, one to the smaller employment groups. And the fact that we've constantly drip-fed the well-being tips, so about sleep, resilience, exercise, eating healthy. We've put things on specially. We said to them, what do you think would help? So we now do an online yoga class. We've done webinars on resilience. We've promoted again our in-house mental health first aiders. We call them mental wellness teams. They prefer that, and made sure that everybody knows how to contact them. And picking up on Matthew's point, they are qualified, but all we want them to do is listen, engage, and signpost, whether that's signpost to a GP or whatever, and do those things. But yeah, it's the fact that we have kept it constant. We have been there. We've kept the channels open. That, I believe, is what they've appreciated more than anything.
David, thank you. And Poppy, one final thought from you for people who are watching this or who end up watching on catch up. What's the one thing that you hope people will take away and actually do?
Yeah, well, I think when at the peak of the pandemic, I think it was something like 10% of mental health support was accessed through your employers, and that I think is really crucial. The NHS is really struggling still, and businesses are a cornerstone of society. And when you do the kind of work that David is talking about, we take the pressure off of NHS so that actually people, particularly our children who need the expert severe support. So actually businesses playing their part and leaders setting this as an agenda is part of societal good. We can no longer just think about profit, particularly in the recovery stage. Businesses are a part of the ecosystem of the economy, and by doing this small thing, we prevent people getting unwell, which is great for human beings, for families, but we also play a bigger part in society in this recovery stage. So my message to all leaders is, let's do this and let's do it together. Let's learn from each other. Let's be brave and not perfect.
Thank you, Poppy. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, David. We have a gear change, CBI at 10 on Wednesday, which is going to be looking really at the reopening. Callum Biggins, who's the Director of Campaigns, and Anna Leach, the Deputy Chief Economist, we're looking at tomorrow's Queen's speech at the terms of the reopening. So do join us at 10. But Matthew, I'm going to give the last word to you. What's your focus on for this week?
Well, focus for this week, James, I mentioned right at the top, we're going sort of really big picture on the international piece and then getting stuck into that detail of the reopening that we'll get into on Wednesday, but plenty on. James, my final thought on this topic today that we've been talking about is actually, if there's one takeaway from it, I'd say be proactive on it. Don't wait for people to sort of put their hand up and ask, even if you've got all the help in the world available. It's a big thing to ask for it. Make sure you're proactively reaching in, checking in with people and asking if there is more you can be doing.
Matthew, thank you very much. A big thank you to Poppy, Anna and David for joining. Matthew, good to see you, and have a very good week, everyone. Thanks so much.